So thank you all for coming. I'll call the meeting to order. First item on our agenda is to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item on our agenda is the consent agenda. This agenda will be considered to be routine and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on these items unless a commissioner or citizen so request, in which case the item will be removed from the consent agenda and placed on the regular agenda. We've had a request from Meridian to defer item A2 until March 7th. So the consent agenda will not include that.
Madam President, I move that we approve the consent agenda with the exception of item A2, which shall be removed.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, this takes us to the regular agenda. And our first item is a presentation by Rhonda Jalbert and Stephen Hunt from Valley Regional Transit to discuss Valley Connect 2.0. So it's going to be Rhonda.
Well, actually, I'm going to turn it over, but I just wanted to introduce Stephen Hunt. He's our new transportation planner. He's originally from Boise, but has worked in Seattle, and he has been putting together our Valley Connect, which is all of the public transportation for Ada and Canyon counties, and it is based off of Communities in Motion. So I will present Stephen Hunt.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, members of the Commission. Glad to be here. Want to thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about Valley Connect 2.0, and thank you for the coordination that the relationship between VRT and ACHD. I know that it's not an easy task to get people where they need to go, and often a thankless task. So appreciate your work on that. Today, just wanted to present what the Valley Connect 2.0 plan is, talk a little bit about how it supports local development, and give an update on where we are with public outreach. I know that we've already reached out to your staff on getting information about the survey and the plan out on the websites, so we appreciate your coordination with that. And then just open up for any comments or questions. To begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about where we're coming from to find two quick terms and that help lay the foundation for how we're thinking about transportation and what it's doing. So, and those two terms are urban and freedom. And by urban, all that we mean is anytime that there's an excessive competition for public space. And so we think about, you see that every time there's road congestion, but you also see that in terms of the types of conflicts that can occur, not just between vehicles, but between vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists. And anytime that competition exists is all I mean when I say urban. And you see that often in your typical urban settings, but also you see that in areas that might otherwise seem less urban. In other words, you don't have to have the tall buildings to have that kind of competition for space, but the result is the same. It becomes how do we prioritize and how do we use that space to the greatest extent possible, moving people. The next is freedom, and all I mean by freedom in this case is being able to get where you want, when you want, to do what you want. And so this is something that we all experience in our lives. We are at a certain place and we want to be somewhere else a lot of times. The opportunities that life presents to us are someplace else. And so the gap is an important question about how do we bridge that gap? How do we help people get from wherever they are to the opportunities that exist somewhere in their community? And so freedom is the ability for us to be able to bridge that gap. And so those two concepts lead us to the point that the public's freedom is often determined by how we allocate that space. And it's super obvious in really built up urban environments, like the picture here on the left. You can see that you don't have a lot of other options. You've got these canyons, and how we allocate the space between cars and pedestrians and cyclists really dictate the amount of mobility and freedom that can occur on that location. But again, that same thing happens in less urban places. The picture on the right showing a woman who's pushing a stroller down the street. her opportunities to get where she needs to go are also driven by how we're allocating that space. And what's interesting to me in this is that what cities and public agencies choose to accommodate is the thing that people will choose to use to fulfill their life, because freedom is that important to them, that they will use whatever means we provide them. So whether that's freeways or parking lots or bikeways or transit. When we look at the amount of transit that's in Ada County, what's been happening in 2008, when we went to fixed bus stops as opposed to flag stops, the year after that we saw a roughly 15% increase, and that's an example of how as we accommodate travel opportunities, people take advantage of them, because in the end they're not as interested in the mode as they are in achieving that opportunity, in realizing that freedom to live a full life. And so again, that example of going from flag stop to fixed stop system is another example of how VRT and ACHD have been able to work together to improve the mobility of the riding public. So where does that lead us with Valley Connect? We built Valley Connect, as Rhonda mentioned, out of the Communities in Motion plan, which, as you know, forecasts employment and population growth targets, as well as, not targets, but what growth is coming to the Treasure Valley, as well as what the traffic demands will be. And Valley Connect is based on what the region has decided or agreed to in terms of the amount of transit service that's needed for that growth. So we looked at the gap between where we are today and where we need to be by 2025, and Valley Connect would quadruple the amount of transit service in the region. We have about 100,000 hours of service today, and Valley Connect would plan for 400,000 hours of service. That allows us to provide much more frequent service in many more places, so we'd have as many as 9 different frequent routes that connect to the Treasure Valley. We'd be making investments along with the highway districts, both ACHD and in Canyon County, making improvements in roadways to help make transit run faster. We're building on the work that we've already done, particularly with ACHD and transit signal priority. Those types of investments we look to continue and expand to over 100 miles of roadway across the Ada and Canyon County. One of the things we hear most often from our riders is that they want service to start sooner and end later, so extending the span of service, and so Valley Connect certainly does that. It provides not only more frequent service, but service for a longer period of time. The result of that is we have set our target for growing ridership by 800%, which is a significant growth, but it's achievable when we could quadruple the amount of service and at the same time double our productivity. And those two assumptions are built off of analyzing what our peers are able to produce in terms of boardings per hour, as well as looking at the more productive services in Ada and Canyon County. If we look at the amount of service that is attracted on State Street and Emerald, for example, having that kind of use across the system would be the type of productivity that we'd be looking to do, and that's achievable when we have higher levels of service and don't have service just runs once an hour and ends at 7 p.m. We'd also be looking at making sure that the systems are well integrated with other options. So whether that's looking at the full suite of mobility options, and there's a lot of exciting things that are going on right now in the transportation world, and Valley Connect positions us to leverage those innovations, whether that's expansion of TNC such as Lyft and Uber, or application of automated vehicles, transit vehicles, others that we can help extend transit into areas that maybe current costs for fixed route service would be prohibitive. So within Valley Connect, there are two scenarios. There's an intermediate and a growth scenario, and the growth scenario is the one that bridges the gap between where we are now and where Communities in Motion says we should be by 2025. And so there you can see we grow from the 100,000 hours of current service to 400,000 hours. That's a quadrupling of service. The intermediate scenario would be a step halfway in between. So it's a recognition of the fact that making that step all the way up to the growth scenario would be a large step, and so we provided an intermediate step in the plan. But it's important to note that the growth scenario is really the amount of service that we as a region have been forecasting for public transit in 2025. Those service investments would be coupled with capital investment. They're not insignificant. If we look at the types of, actually, I've got another slide. We'll come back to that. So the capital costs are not insignificant. We'll look at those in a bit more detail in a slide or two. Commissioner Woods, did you have a question?
Yes.
You've got a footnote down there at the bottom, includes 23 million in deferred maintenance on existing network. What's that?
So what these different scenarios, the current, intermediate, and growth, were intended to do is give us a snapshot of kind of where we are today versus where we need to be and halfway in between. And the where we are today is not sufficient to cover all of our capital needs. So it's that 23 million is in essence a backlog of capital investments that we would need to make to maintain our existing system that are outside our forecasted revenues.
But are they buses?
Yes, I mean, so some of that is bus replacement. It's also maintenance of our existing facilities, and et cetera.
Okay, and I missed what you said about 2025. Where are you projected to be in 2025?
The growth network, the growth scenario.
So in 7 years, you're supposed to be at 400,000 hours?
That's correct.
Okay.
And that's based on the Communities in Motion plan, where we were looking at the amount of transit service that the region was trying to have in place to accommodate the travel and both the employment and the population growth and travel demand on the network.
So again, just to follow up, so you need 191 million in capital and then a $40 million a year operating? Is that?
That's correct. Mm-hmm. For fixed route service.
Commissioner Arnold?
Thank you. It's my understanding that various land use jurisdictions are not following Communities in Motion. So shouldn't you be basing your plans on the growth that's actually occurring, not a plan that's being ignored?
Yes, and so, do I get to that slide? So the slide that I took out of this presentation shows kind of the context of how Valley Connect was developed, starting with Communities in Motion, but then looking at local comprehensive plans and the work that we did with city staff and others as we developed the Valley Connect network to ensure that the network we're building is supportive of the development that's actually occurring. So, but in terms of the overall size of our network, we used two things to kind of not quite triangulate, but because I need a third thing to triangulate, but we looked at what Communities in Motion said, and then what our peers, the size of the networks of our peers. So looking at where Spokane and Reno and Tucson, the amount of transit investments that they make on a per capita basis would suggest also that for us to be on par with our peers, we would need in excess of 400,000 hours of service. So between those, that's how we sized the total network. But then when we went to work with the stakeholders and city staff on how would we develop that network and what would that network need to look like to support the growth that's actually occurring, that's how we blended the two together, if that makes sense.
Could you go back to the previous slide? So you're gonna have to explain this to me. Your annual fixed route service hours, you plan to go from 100,000 to 400,000, which is great, because that's, I think you're right. One of the complaints about the bus system has been that it just doesn't go early enough, go late enough, go often enough.
Right.
Okay, so you get to 400,000, well, and your operating costs track with that. So 10 million to 40 million, 100,000 to 400,000, but your capital costs go from 15 million to 191 million. It's like, it's exponentially more. So it doesn't really track for me. Explain how you get the need for $191 million. Even backing out 23 million.
Right. Part of that would be if you included the 23 million in the current, so you double between current and then the intermediate, and then between the intermediate and the growth, again, that's roughly a doubling again. But what we're, the types of investments that we're doing is if we're expecting to have 10 million, grow our ridership 800%, have 10 million different boardings a year, then that means 10 million different times that somebody's waiting on the side of the road for the bus to show up. That many more people at shelters, that many more people asking, when is the bus coming? And we need that many more vehicles to carry those people. So all of those things together, we're trying to make it a network that is more accommodating and convenient than the one we have today. In addition to that, I mentioned, so if we jump to this slide, which looks at those capital expenses, you'll see that for the intermediate and the current, the largest expense is in our buses. But as we get into the growth, the largest single expense is in vehicles. When we look at the growth network, the corridor improvements become the largest single investment. And so those are investments that we would be making to help the buses move faster through traffic. Those would be, and so just to make the math simple, what we're assuming there is about $600,000 a mile for investments in those premium corridors. So it's not right-of-way that we're buying necessarily, but it would be investments to help make transit move through traffic better. So it would be enhancements on the TSP network, for example, or capital investments in the roadway to help transit move faster through traffic. So those are the types of investments that help the network grow and help attract more people to the system.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Arnold?
What are passenger amenities? Because I note that you're showing now you have 0 and you're projecting 11 million for that. What's in?
So passenger amenities would be things like shelters and benches and transit station or hubs. So to build the network out, we would be building, not everything is going to be a Main Street station, but when we get into the network, you'll see that we create a new hub in the city of Meridian. So there would be investments to help create those connection points where you're going to have people transferring or coming into transit to connect to transit in between routes.
So are you anticipating that the routes that you put up on that map will be the only routes that will carry the 400,000 hours of trips?
When we get in, yeah, we can look at that network, and so what we've modeled would be the size and shape of that network, which would include 400,000 hours of service. Yes.
Basically, you're still sticking with the 9 routes.
There would be 9 routes that would be frequent all day. There would be many more that are not necessarily frequent all day routes. And so I'll show you that in a second.
Feed into that, okay.
Uh-huh.
Commissioner Arnold, we're sorry, we're just
Yep.
throwing these ideas out here now, and hopefully it's not throwing you off your presentation.
Just trying to understand what you're presenting. So
Sure.
for corridor improvements, you're going from 0 today to 66 million. What's included in that? Because I would have thought that would include bus shelters, but what's the $66 million for?
So again, that is about 600,000 a mile for investments in things like potentially holdouts or other TSP investments. So investments in signals, other ways that we could get transit to move quicker through the traffic. And at this point, it's a placeholder. It's something that we know we need. We haven't identified every single investment, and in some cases they may be much more. You might have miles that are much more intensive than that, right? But as we're building this budget, that was how we came up with this. So we've got 100 miles of investment, we're 100 miles of premium service that we're trying to get transit to move fast up and down those corridors, and you'll see those in a second. And so we know that we'll be needing to bring money to help make that happen. And so that's what this is about. And we also know that of all of these investments, that's the one that is probably the most important to this agency and the other highway districts and highway construction agencies, because that's where we're kind of in the same space. How do we have transit moving up and down the roadway? Is that helpful?
It
So
was,
it's separate,
yes.
but it's separate, so think of it as everything between the curbs, and then passenger amenities are things that are off the curb.
Got it.
So today, this is the network that exists in Ada County. Yellow is just showing that these are services that come at the most every 30 minutes. More often, they're hourly services. You can't see span in this map, but we know the services, except for the 9 and the 7, they go to bed by 7 or 8. And so we'll talk, as we mentioned earlier, this plan would extend a lot of those networks to run to 10 or later. The growth network would look like this. This is the conceptual network that we're proposing. And so real quick, so we can kind of do this back and forth, you can see in the current that we don't make it very far west. And so that's another thing that we hear a lot about. In the growth network, we certainly move farther to the west in Boise, make better connections to Meridian. All the blue lines, those are the lines where we've been making investments in the corridor to have transit move faster. And so you can see those main corridors of Fairview, Overland, Chinden, State Street, Curtis would be, Vista would be, all be the areas where we'd be looking to make investments to ensure that transit's able to move quickly up and down that corridor. And where VRT has the capacity to bring money to the table to make that happen, right? So that's one reason why it's important for us to be planning for that in this Valley Connect plan. The blue lines, in addition to having that corridor investment, would also have the higher levels of service. So those would be the routes that are running 15 minutes, at least in the peak period. Most, except for the ones that are on the freeway, they'd be running that often all day. The red lines are services that also run every 15 minutes, but aren't necessarily supported by that higher capital investment in the roadway. And then the yellow lines, again, are services that come every 30 minutes or less often. And the green lines are routes that are mostly oriented towards the freeways and highways. So this is the network of services that probably has the most impact on on the relationship between VRT and ACHD. We'd be building on the planning that's already underway on State Street with the T-top and building a premium corridor up and down State Street. We'd be looking to do similar things again on Fairview, on Overland, and on Vista. So you know that State Street, Fairview, and Vista are the city of Boise's best-in-class corridors, and we would be supporting that with Valley Connect supports that concept, and we would be expanding on that with the growth network to include Overland and Curtis and Chinden as well. We'd also be looking to ensure that maybe additional passenger amenities are along those red lines, so that's where maybe additional shelters and things would be to help make it more convenient for passengers and riders. The black line there is an example of the rail corridor. This plan does not fund that, but it's there as a point of reference and something that we are building towards by building a much more robust transit network that would support any eventual rail connections between Ada and Canyon County. Yeah, so as we mentioned, the real purpose, though, of what transit's doing is it's connecting people from where they are to where they're trying to go, connecting them to their opportunities. And so the sum of all of those investments, the network and those capital improvements, are how well is it expanding people's reach? How much farther can they go? What additional things can they connect to? And so this is a map of how far an individual could get on transit and walking in 15, 30, 45, and 60 minutes today if they were standing at Veterans Memorial Parkway and State Street at 7 a.m. And so you can see you can move up and down the State Street corridor relatively well. You can move up and down Vista, but it's largely kind of a corridor look. With the growth network, we are trying to really expand the number of places you can go, both to the east and the west. You're starting to connect Meridian and Eagle with Boise, and as well as improving a lot the north-south connections. And when you do that, you open up all the other east-west corridors. So you can see not only can you move up and down State Street, but you can also move up and down Ustick and Fairview and Emerald and Overland and then north-south, and Chinden, not to mention Chinden. You can also move up and down Curtis, so we're making the north-south connection from across the river on Curtis up to the airport and on Broadway, all of those become much more convenient connections. And so the number of places that an individual can get on transit dramatically increases. And that's the foundation behind which we are pinning our target of ridership growth, is by connecting more people to more places more often is the thing that will encourage people, the single most important thing that will encourage people to take transit. So I have a couple of these slides. We'll just kind of move through them quickly that show the before and after. This is a Main Street station, so this is the most transit-rich environment that we have currently in the Treasure Valley. And you can cover most of Boise, but again, you'll notice you can't make it very far west. There's actually a significant part of West Boise that's off that map, and certainly Meridian. But with the growth network, we really expand on each of those main primary east-west corridors connecting Meridian. You can see the purple dots out there at CWI and in Nampa, moving off the map. Also, much improving the connections to the airport and to Micron. So many of the things that we hear from people about why can't we have a bus that does this, or why can't we have that kind of service, are things that we're planning for, and we certainly can start to achieve with the Valley Connect plan. So this is 5 Mile and Ustick on the west end of town, and again, the amount of service that's on that part of town is currently fairly poor, and you can see why it attracts so few riders, is because there's few places that you can get on transit today. That same location in the future, again, you're opening up each of those east-west corridors as well as being able to move north-south, and it becomes a real option for a lot more types of trips. And then in Meridian, so this is at the Village. So to your point, Commissioner Arnold, like how are we responding to development that's actually happening? There is no service today at the Village, and so your transit accessibility is that. But in the future, Meridian really becomes a kind of more central to what transit can connect you to, both to the east and the west, whether you're moving to Nampa or into Boise. Again, on all of the major east-west arterials, you have good transit access, which again makes access to the Village, whether you're going there for shopping or for employment, much more attractive. But the Village isn't the only thing that's there. You can talk about Blue Cross or Sensi, or up and down the Eagle corridor, you've got St. Luke's at the freeway. So all these things are ways that we're trying to make those connections more real and more accessible. And why we believe it's so important that we have a dramatic increase in the amount of transit service that's out there today, than what's out there today. We know that, so that's the investments that we've been making in the fixed route system. We know that we'd also need to help people ride between the lines, so to speak, and we would be building on our existing community transportation options, looking both at the traditional methods of doing that, as well as leveraging innovations in technology to help make those first and last mile connections. So what role could automation play in that, whether that's automated vehicles that help circulate people through larger business parks to help keep transit moving up and down the corridors faster, or applying automation to those core services as well. So those are things that we're exploring and certainly keen on being able to realize with the plan. So I mentioned that, we went to the VRT board in January with the draft plan, and they approved the plan for public comment. And so that's the period of time that we're in now, is soliciting comment from the public on the plan and doing outreach both to stakeholders and agencies such as this, as well as soliciting comment from the general public. We have an open house this evening at Main Street Station, and one again on first Thursday down at Main Street Station. So we appreciate the help that we've received thus far from ACHD on encouraging public to participate in that. We have over 460 comments last time I checked. That was yesterday on the plan. So we're happy. We're excited that there's that many. We have goals to get much higher than that, and so we continue to push participation from the public and comments. We will take those comments and incorporate them into the final plan and be back at the VRT board in April, where we hope to approve the final plan.
Commissioner Arnold has a question.
So how do you plan to fund this? That has to be part of the discussion, I would think, and what's the plan for funding it? And are you including that funding plan in your public outreach for public comment?
So Valley Connect at this point does not include a funding plan. It's the first step towards getting there. And so that will still be to come. And we know that that's going to be, you know, the very next part, not even the next, it's part of the conversation now as we think about what this means. But it is not explicitly called out in the plan.
Just to follow up though, wouldn't it be helpful in the public outreach process to ask the public how they'd like to see it funded or what they would be willing to do in terms of funding?
That may be. We did not ask for comment on specific funding options. We did ask what they would be willing to pay in terms of supporting transit if it met certain criteria. So there are 2 questions in there about funding that we did ask, and we are getting some interesting comments back from that. But from what I can tell, most of the way the public is reading those is what would they be willing to pay in fares to support that. And so we'll have to, it's part of the conversation, but it is part of the conversation that we're trying to engage with our stakeholders, such as yourselves and others, about, okay, where do we go from here? And it's certainly the conversation, as Commissioner Hanson can attest to, that we're having at the VRT board level is how do we mobilize around this? One reason, I'll say, this will be the last thing I say on this, unless there's other questions, would be that the plan is intended to be an empowering or an opportunistic plan in the sense that we're trying to identify projects that people could organize around if we can find the funding and deliver. And so that's one way that we're engaging both at the local city level, as well as with stakeholders such as St. Luke's and other private industry about what's important to them, which of these services would be most important to them that they'd be willing to support.
Commissioner Goldthorpe?
Yes, thank you. How aggressively are you pushing this survey out? I saw it on Facebook, I believe, Meridian Press, but I don't know if what you're using. I haven't seen it anywhere else.
So we are trying to use both social media, Facebook. We have several different sites that are associated with Valley Regional Transit. We're pushing that out, and we will be refreshing those next week as well. And then when we drafted the plan, we contacted each of the different jurisdictions about getting it posted on their websites. Same time, we talked to the ACHD about getting it on your guys' communications, pushing it out as well to Nextdoor. But we're continuing to follow up on those.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if we don't utilize our Nextdoor account for that, the Ada County has a county-wide one as well. Now, I took the survey, and I did not interpret the financial questions to be fares. I interpreted it to be how much per year would you be willing to see, like on property tax or something. And that was fairly clear to me what they were asking, so I'm surprised.
Well, the only reason I mentioned that is because there were a couple of follow-up comments that mentioned some unclarity. That's not a word.
Unclear.
There we go. The questions were unclear in terms of what the specific mechanism of collecting that money would be, whether that was via fares or some other means. But we do feel like it does give us at least a sense of what people are thinking about in terms of the cost proposition for transit service.
Did Compass put this out, for public comment as well? Because I think their reach is pretty wide.
We've done our initial push. We need to do some follow-up to see how far down it has made it. And that's where we're at right now. And so it's open till the 15th of March, and we'll be working with folks again it's been kind of a steady stream of comments, but we haven't, one day we had kind of a spike, but we're hoping to get some media press or anything that we can do to help increase the visibility of the plan.
So I just want to thank Steve. This is a long time in the process. The assumption that was built from the board was that communities Communities in Motion and the long-range plan assumes a new funding source, a new dedicated funding source. And so the push came to, what if we took existing funding sources that we already have, obviously VRT gets local funds, and can access FTA funds through the large and the small urban area funding system. And so, if we were to do that, what would be the most ideal over the next, and we picked 7 years. And so this is a growth scenario using the existing funding authority. What I didn't ask earlier would be, and it's probably too hard to tell because it overlaps a couple of large urban, small urban, different FTA funding criteria, is of, especially the capital, which is what FTA will help fund, what portion of that is federal, so that we sort of have a sense what kind of local match do we have to come up with, because we leave a lot of federal money on the table, or I should say we let it go to other jurisdictions because we don't come up with the local. Is there something, that's probably something the public isn't nearly as like, okay, what's this federal, state funding, and all the large and small urbans, but is there a way of analyzing that based on the federal match?
Well, and so that, I think, highlights kind of where we are in terms of this financial plan. And so we need to, there are lots of ways to kind of cook that goose. You can, and so we don't have that planned out just yet, but it's part of where we need to go next. And the value that the Valley Connect plan has is it gives us the thing that we're trying to cook, right? And so when we think about whether you're debt financing or not, or whatever, all of those things are going to have an impact on the load that you're going to be asking local jurisdictions to bear to fund those.
Yeah, and we have some experience because the single largest capital expenditure was a federal investment that we had to reach, which is the Main Street station. And ACHC put a little bit in with the right-of-way, and Boise put in. There were private investments that were made. So it's once everybody started realizing you put a little bit on the table, it started to add up. Little like, excuse the reference, loaves and fishes. Next thing you know, you had the resources, we could do it, and that was the major capital project.
And I think that's a fair representation of kind of where we're at right now, is to be able to have more substantive conversations about what that would look like.
Good, thanks.
In terms of funding.
Have you finished your presentation?
I think I have.
Okay. No, I'm not telling you have to.
Well,
finish.
no,
I just-
this slide only says kind of, again, where we're at. The only thing that I guess that I would highlight here is, again, the coordinated efforts that are currently underway with ACHD, in particular around State Street and communicating what we're trying to accomplish there. That's the type of thing that that will build on the Valley Connect plan, or rather that we want to leverage to talk about the Valley Connect plan. And we see those types of partnerships growing. Which is why I wanted to show that premium corridor map, because you could see where else we would be looking to do similar kinds of things. And so those are what we see as kind of the next steps, and that was it.
Thank you. Any, Commissioner Woods?
Final comment, I know that Commissioner Baker always appreciates analogies like, cooking geese and things like that.
Well, that may have not been an approach. Cooking
But-
someone's goose. I mean, it's not a good thing.
And I know Commissioner Baker and Commissioner Hanson have wrestled with this, but if we don't get this funding piece, it's a good plan, but we got to get to this funding issue, or our goose is going to be cooked.
Yeah.
We can't just keep.
I needed a different animal.
Yes. Well.
It's a good plan, but the funding piece, we got to have some urgency in addressing that.
Yeah, I do think the plan is good. I think it's very informative. I'm glad you came and told us about it. Good ideas,
Thank you.
and hopefully you'll be next working on the funding part of it.
Indeed.
Say hi to your folks for me.
I sure will. Thank you, Commissioner Goldsworth.
I just had one question. this was just a presentation. You're not asking for anything today.
No, other than, because I know we've already reached out to staff about kind of awareness of the plan, but if there are ways that we could check to see, like, how far did it make it on Nextdoor? Is it something that's on there on kind of from the ACHD channels? That would be maybe a follow-up that we could do, if that's all right. And then we will continue the conversation. I mean, it's not explicitly to Valley Connect, but we'll continue this kind of conversation about how we communicate what we're trying to accomplish with the State Street corridor, and so you'll see those conversations continue that tie back to what we're trying to accomplish with Valley Connect. And then we'll be talking about funding.
Well, I think
upcoming
when we
months.
have our hearings on, State Street and VMP, State Street and Collister,
Right.
our programs, I think it would be worthwhile if you all came in and gave some perspective on that, because that State Street TTOP was a combined effort between a number of jurisdictions, including VRT and ACHD.
That's correct.
And we are implementing that plan. So I think it would be helpful if, we had some input from VRT about how well that plan is being developed or developed out.
Yes, and that is kind of one of the near term, not even next steps, it's steps that we're taking right now. It's not, I guess I'm having trouble in my brain because it's not explicitly Valley Connect, but the two are definitely related.
Okay, great. Any other comments or questions? Well, thank you, Mr. Hunt.
Thank you very much.
A couple of geese with you on the way out.
There's plenty of them out there. You could cook a lot of them. All right. Next item on our agenda is Resolution 2220 and Resolution 2221, Ash Street Vacation. This is a public hearing. I will open the public hearing and we will have a staff report from Diane Bevins.
Madam President, Commissioners, Diane Bevins, Capital Projects Manager. This is a public hearing to vacate a public alley right-of-way known as Ash Street. This will be one presentation, but we need two resolutions and two motions. As noted in the staff report, the City of Boise and Capital City Development Corporation are requesting vacation of public alley right-of-way at the location known as Ash Street, located near the corner of Ash Street and River Street. The City of Boise will receive approximately 743 square feet, and CCDC will receive approximately 3,224. The City of Boise has an interagency governmental agreement for waiver of costs and fees, so no fee is charged for the City of Boise transfer. CCDC has submitted an appraisal with a value opinion as of June 28th, 2017 in the amount of $33,000. The vicinity map depicts the location of the vacation in relation to Ash Street. Ash Street is here on the east side and River Street is here on the south. The close-up view of the site is here. The red area is the area that to be vacated to the City of Boise, and the yellow hatched area is to be vacated to CCDC. The right-of-way is not necessary and is better utilized for development. Staff recommendation is to adopt and sign resolution numbers 2220 and 2221, authorizing the proposed vacation of public alley right-of-way. I will remain stand-in for any questions or comments.
Are there any questions for Diane? Okay, this is a public hearing. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to this issue? Come ahead. If you could give your name and address for the record.
My name is Karen Bubb. My address is 2425 Ellis Avenue, Boise, Idaho. And I'm here today on behalf of the City of Boise. I'm the cultural planner for the City of Boise. And we are working, the house that is on the property adjacent to where the City of Boise is requesting the vacation is a stone house that was owned by the Haymans. And the City of Boise is speaking with Capital City Development Corporation about the possibility of that being gifted to the City of Boise so that we can make that into a culture facility, specifically to celebrate the history of the African American and immigrant neighborhood that this area was, and to make the area around the property a public space We have had a public art team look at the property to identify how it can be made a better public gathering space. So the vacation of that alley would support that public access to and from both the nearby Pioneer Pathway, the sidewalk areas, and in the future, hopefully around that house to make that a more publicly accessible and engaged area. We don't have the programming portion of that house identified yet in terms of what the house would actually be used for, but we are looking to preserve the house and the property as a public amenity. So I'm speaking on behalf of the vacation. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to comment on this item? Okay, if not, I'll close the public hearing, and Commission, you have it before you for two motions.
Madam President,
Mr. Hanson,
I would move adoption of Resolution 2220, the vacation of the property indicated, and a finding that it is in the public interest.
I'll second it.
okay, any discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Hanson,
I make a motion to adopt Resolution 2221, vacation of the Ash Street Valley, and a finding of fact and conclusion of law that is in the public interest.
Second that one.
okay, any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Commission, that concludes our regular agenda. The final thing is public communications. Is there anyone from the audience who wishes to address the